He was never supposed to survive. James Carter, a former U.S. officer, beaten beyond recognition, his hands bound tight, his head slumped against the tinted glass of a stolen SUV, stranded in the heart of the Arizona desert. He was ready to give up, until 3 unknown German shepherds appeared out of the shimmering heat like 4-legged angels. No collars, no names. No one knew how they found his trail, or what drove them to refuse to walk away. But as the first rays of sunlight broke across the horizon, those 3 creatures made a choice James would remember for the rest of his life. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a miracle written in paw prints. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And if you believe that every animal carries a piece of heaven within them, hit that subscribe button, because this story will change the way you look at dogs forever. Tucson in late summer wears its heat like armor, a hard, sun-burnished shell that clings to stucco walls, ripples off asphalt, and turns distant mountains the color of baked copper. The afternoon sky was a polished steel blue without a single charitable cloud. The air itself seemed to rattle with cicadas and the thin, metallic hum of power lines strung along Route 86. Wind came in withered breaths, pushing desert dust across the shoulders of the highway and stacking it in pale drifts against road signs and the low, ragged clumps of mesquite. You could taste the dryness on your tongue, a chalky reminder that everything here survives by knowing when to be still. At the edge of this heat-hammered day stood Saguaro Stop, a squat roadside diner with faded turquoise trim and a neon sign that blinked a tired promise of coffee, pie. Air conditioning. Inside, the cool held just enough, the air conditioner coughing to keep up, while a ceiling fan pushed a slow, stubborn breeze. The cracked linoleum floor showed ghosted footprints where boots and trucker soles had tracked in desert. A jukebox near the back wall leaned a few degrees off plumb and offered dusty country standards from the years when radios still had knobs. Behind the counter stood Sylvia Ramirez, 50 years old with steady hands and a posture that said she carried more than plates. She was a Latina woman of medium height and a long, angular frame that had turned purposeful thin from years of work. Her face was shaped by time and weather, deep-set hazel eyes that held shadows and warmth in equal portions, olive skin burnished by Tucson sun, and a jawline that had learned to clench before it learned to tremble. Her black hair, streaked with honest silver, was coiled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck, a practical style that kept it out of coffee and out of the way. She wore a denim shirt rolled at the sleeves, a desert green apron, and faint scars across her forearms from a life of hot pans and hotter days. People who stopped here saw a quiet woman running a quiet place. People who stayed long enough understood she measured out kindness like cream. Not stingy, not lavish, careful enough to last. Once, she had laughed easily. That was before a training accident at Camp Pendleton took her husband, Felix, a Marine, who had taught her that good men sometimes go where luck cannot follow. She bought the diner with the compensation and her savings, then filled its hours with the kind of work that keeps grief in the corners. The bell over the door rang with a small, well-mannered chime, though no one crossed the threshold. Sylvia glanced up with the reflex of habit and saw the reason a beat later. 3 German shepherds stood outside in the glare, poised on the mat as if they understood a rule about asking permission. The first stepped in, and with him the room seemed to inhale. He was big, tall through the shoulders and long through the rib, a dark sable coat washed with dust and burned lightly by sun. Age showed in the silver threading of his muzzle, and in a thin crescent scar drawing a pale arc over his right eye, like an old mark left by wire or thorn. His ears were high and still, His amber eyes were attentive without being hard. He walked with cautious authority, the gait of a dog who had learned both consequence and restraint. This was Alpha, though no one in that diner knew his name yet. If dignity had a shape, it looked a little like him. Close behind came the second, a shade smaller, with a classic saddle pattern and a neat white notch at the front of his chest, like someone had pressed a thumbprint of snow into his fur. His movements were quick, nose twitching as he tasted the air and catalogued the room, filing away scents. Coffee, fryer oil, coolant, old vinyl, human sweat, like evidence. Alertness ran along his spine. His eyes flicked from window to door with the metronome regularity of a sentry on an interior post. This was Bravo, wired for pattern, for signal, for what didn't belong. The third slipped over the threshold with an uncertain spring. He was younger, the paws a little too big, the legs a little too fast for his balance. His coat ran dark and tan like burnt toast at the back, and bright honey at the legs, and his ears, not yet fully disciplined, tilted with emotion. He kept himself half a pace behind the others, and exhaled a brief, hopeful sound when he looked at people. This was Charlie, barely out of puppyhood by the look of his bright, searching eyes and the looseness of his jowls when he yawned. He wasn't fearless, not exactly. He was brave in the way of the young, which is to say he trusted leaders to make sense of fear. A man in the corner booth lowered his newspaper, revealing a face lined by sun and long-haul miles. Glenn Murdoch, late 60s, wiry and short, with a permanent squint like he expected life to throw glare at him. He wore a red flannel shirt, rubbed white at the elbows, and the flattened cap beside him advertised a seed company that probably no longer existed. He took his tea without sugar and his gossip without apology, and he looked at the dogs with the kind of recognition that didn't come out of nowhere. A young couple at the counter, a nursing student with freckles like confetti across a pale bridge of nose, and a pizza delivery kid with forearms inked in cheap tattoo lines, pushed their stools back an inch, not out of fear, but out of respect. Sylvia set down the glass napkin holder she had been polishing and stepped around the end of the counter. "Well," she said, her voice low and sanded smooth by years of talking to people who didn't plan to talk back. "You boys look like you walked across half the desert." She filled a big stainless steel bowl at the soda gun and slid it onto a clean square of floor near a faded rug. Alpha approached first with grave moderation. Bravo drank with working haste. Charlie hesitated until Sylvia stepped back, then dropped his muzzle and slurped with open joy, water freckling his whiskers. She noted details automatically. No tags, no collars, ribs not gaunt but visible, claws worn, eyes clear, dogs that had traveled far, dogs that had belonged to something once. The door chimed again, and this time a man entered. Tall, somewhere near 6 feet, shoulders squared in a light gray suit that fit like money. His blonde hair was clean parted with the kind of precision that suggests a measuring comb. His skin was indoor pale and untroubled by sun. His eyes were a blue that didn't bother to warm. His face was handsomely assembled in a catalog way. A long, straight nose, a chin that kinked slightly obvious at the cleft, cheekbones drawn by a disciplined barber's chair. He carried himself with a clipped efficiency that said lines, not curves. Under the jacket there was weight at the left shoulder that printed faintly through worsted wool. If you knew what to notice, you could notice a holster. His hands were clean, the nails trimmed to neutral, the veins quiet beneath skin that didn't know wrenches. He did not smell like the highway. He smelled like hotel air and the ghost of aftershave. This was Elliot Crane, though no one asked and he didn't offer. He chose a stool at the counter with a view of the window and the lot beyond. and when Sylvia came with the pot, he said, "Black?" in a New England voice, flattened R's and a practiced pleasantness that never made it to his eyes. "We've got pecan pie," Sylvia said, performing the ritual. "Not hungry," he answered, gaze leashed to the glass. When she poured the coffee, his left hand found the mug without looking. His right hand lay near the jacket's parted hem, almost but not quite brushing the leather strap that ran beneath. The room's cord tightened a half step, that human instrument that knows when violence has been in the same room with breakfast. Sylvia moved along the counter, topping a trucker's cup and replacing a basket of sugar packets, like a woman who inhabits her routine until it becomes a place to stand. But her eyes drifted, as eyes do, to the window. A gray SUV had just angled into the far edge of the lot, where the pavement thinned into gravel and low mesquite, then stopped with a hum that didn't settle into silence. Heavy tint on every pane, engine idling, no doors opening, no one getting out to stretch their road-tired bones. Nothing happening for a long beat, which was its own kind of happening. Sylvia had learned to trust stillness. The desert will teach you that. Bravo stopped drinking first. His head snapped up, water diamonds dripping from whiskers, ears speared toward the glass. A small, involuntary sound rose in his throat, not a growl so much as a note that says a decision might be near. Charlie froze, then tipped forward on his toes, a puppy's body deciding it could be a bow if he needed it to be. Alpha stood with deliberate calculation and faced the window. Legs square beneath him, jaw set in a neutral line that never pretended to softness. The jukebox ticked and coughed itself into Merle Haggard. Someone in the kitchen dropped a spoon. The clatter startled nobody except the teenage dishwasher, who had only been alive long enough to misunderstand danger. Elliot's gaze tracked a charmless arc from the SUV to the dogs and back. He lifted the mug, took a professional sip, and set it down with a small, measured tap. The tap came again 7 seconds later, then again, as if time was a thing he trusted only when he kept touching it. Sylvia's eyes went from his fingers to the window and back, building a small, quiet bridge in her mind between a habit and its reason. She had heard a line once, long ago from Felix on a porch with a beer, about how a man who is timing something is never just passing time. "Refill?" she asked, because offering is a way to buy moments. "No," he said, and the word had a click at the end, like a button closing. Glenn cleared his throat at the corner booth. "You see them dogs?" he said, not to anyone exactly, and not to no one. "Saw 3 like that a month back when the sheriff's boys searched the Santa Cruz Wash for that missing lady. Strays, only they weren't. Sat like they belonged to orders. Didn't pester the K9s. Didn't bark none. Watched like men do." Sylvia glanced at him. He lifted one palm, an old-timer's semaphore for "I'm not making weather." Alpha took a step toward the door and paused. He turned his head just enough to find Sylvia's eyes and held them for a long, level beat. It was not a pleading look. It was not even a request. It was a notification, the way a road sign doesn't ask you to slow down. He pushed the door with his muzzle, and it swung on the spring hinge, the bell chiming its neat little chime. The heat hit him like a line. He crossed it without hurry, hugging the shadow along the low, scrub-lined curb until he reached the SUV's rear passenger door. He lowered himself, shoulders down, belly just above warm concrete, and moved in inches. From inside the diner, the SUV looked like a tinted box with a hum. From where Alpha was, the tint was a veil with seams. A slim gap between a sunshade and a window frame offered half a thumbnail of inside. He put one eye to it and held so still even the flies reconsidered. A human eye looked back, swollen at the lid, a bruise washing yellow into purple, lashes sticky with sweat. It blinked once with effort, slow, hard. Then again. Then again. If you believed in coincidence, you could call it that. If you'd ever been taught signals by a man who worked where the rest of the world pretends it doesn't, you had another word. Inside, Sylvia felt something shift along her ribs the way a shelf shifts when its nails loosen. She didn't know what Alpha saw, but she knew the language of his body, and she knew the weight in air when a thing stops being a maybe and becomes a message. He returned, shoulders level, breathing calm, and crossed the threshold again. He did not sniff at the rug. He did not check the bowl. He walked straight to Sylvia, sat, raised his right paw, and touched it to the floor once. He held. He touched again. He held. He touched a third time, and let it rest there a second longer than the others. Sylvia's throat tightened around heat and memory. It was Felix's voice, sudden as a photograph. 3 is the simplest shape of distress. 3 knocks, 3 flashes, 3 blinks. If you can't speak, you count. She didn't call 911. She tapped a number she hadn't used in months because not everything requires a formal introduction. "Sheriff Rachel Moreno," came the answer, crisp and close. Rachel was 45, a Latina woman with short-cropped dark hair and a lean runner's build, a face lined by field work and night shifts, and eyes that considered before they condemned. She had served 2 tours as an Army MP, then come back to Pima County because order is a habit some people keep, like faith. On duty, she wore a matte black tactical jacket when the heat allowed it, and boots that had kissed more rock than carpet. Off duty, she wore a smile that didn't apologize for being rare. She trusted instinct over protocol when instinct had earned its rank. "Rachel, it's Sylvia," she said, tone carefully flat under the hum. "I need you at Saguaro Stop. There's a vehicle in the lot. I believe someone's inside. And Rachel, my dog's just told me he blinked SOS. A beat traveled the line, not doubt, not disbelief, calculation finding its footing. "On my way, 10 out, Rachel said. "Don't escalate, keep eyes on him. And Sylvia, lock the back." "Copy," Sylvia said, and ended the call. Elliot had not moved except to set his cup down at a right angle to the napkin. His face, reflected faintly in the window glass, wore the expression of a man who has made a plan and does not intend to share it. The right corner of his mouth had tightened, a tiny rope drawing skin. His index finger began a small, patient rhythm on the counter again. Tap, tap, tap. And Sylvia's stomach drew a knot as snug as a tourniquet. Bravo slid along the booths with quiet feet, placing himself near the door where he could pivot to pavement in 1 second and to Elliot in less. Charlie had stopped being a child. He took up a low, solid posture at the jam, legs tucked to spring, mouth closed in a line that said the time for agreeing with everyone had ended. Outside, heat leaned hard against the windows. Inside, the room held itself in the kind of silence that happens right before glass breaks. In that silence, Sylvia picked up a dishcloth because hands need assignments. She looked at Alpha, and he looked back, and something like an agreement passed between a woman who had been taught by a Marine and a dog who seemed to have been taught by a war. End of chapter summary. In a scorched Tucson afternoon, 3 German shepherds, Alpha, elder, scarred, steady, Bravo, alert tracker, and Charlie, young, brave, enter Sylvia Ramirez's roadside diner as a gray SUV idles outside. A cold-controlled man in a tailored suit, Elliot Crane, watches the lot. Alpha confirms a captive inside the SUV through a 3-blink SOS and returns to mark the same signal for Sylvia, who calls Sheriff Rachel Moreno and holds the room in quiet readiness as the air tightens toward an inevitable confrontation. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the rugged Santa Catalina mountains, dragging long fingers of gold and rust across the Tucson sky. Evening was still hours away, but the light had softened, turning the desert's relentless glare into a more patient glow. Yet inside Saguaro Stop, the air felt tighter than ever, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sylvia Ramirez stood behind the counter, her palms pressed flat against the cool laminate, as if grounding herself against what she knew was coming. The 3 dogs had stopped pretending to be strays. Their bodies told the truth now, taut, deliberate, poised. Every muscle fiber hummed with purpose. Alpha had vanished from the diner for nearly a full minute before returning. When he came back, there was something in his eyes Sylvia had never seen before, a steady, unblinking certainty. He crossed the cracked linoleum floor without hesitation and stopped directly in front of her. Then he lowered his paw to the ground and tapped. Once, twice, 3 times. The message needed no translation. Her late husband, Felix, had drilled that code into her years ago. 3 means trouble. 3 means danger. 3 means someone's counting on you. Now, a dog, this aging, silver-muzzled German shepherd with a scar like an old battle map etched above his right eye, had delivered it without a sound. Sylvia's throat tightened. She wiped her damp palms on her apron, then reached beneath the counter for the worn, olive-green rotary phone she rarely used. The line clicked twice before a familiar voice answered. Sheriff Rachel Moreno. Rachel had been Sylvia's closest friend since they were girls playing softball in dusty city parks. At 45, Rachel was a different kind of woman now, still lean and athletic from morning runs through the desert foothills, her deep brown eyes sharper than they had ever been. Years of service as a military police officer had hardened her once easy smile, and a decade as Pima County's sheriff had given her a low, deliberate voice that always seemed to cut straight to the truth. She had short-cropped black hair that brushed the collar of her uniform and a faint scar on her left cheek, a gift from a suspect who hadn't gone quietly 5 years back. Rachel believed in rules, but she trusted instinct even more. "Rachel, it's me," Sylvia said, her voice a notch quieter than usual. "I need you to come to Saguaro Stop. There's a vehicle parked out front. Gray SUV, heavy tint. There's someone inside, and..." She hesitated. "My dogs say he blinked SOS." There was silence on the other end. Not skepticism, but calculation. Rachel didn't laugh off things Sylvia said, and she especially didn't laugh off anything that smelled like military code. "I'm on my way. 10 minutes, Rachel said finally. "Do not approach. Keep the situation calm, and lock your back door." "I already did," Sylvia replied. She hung up and turned her attention back to the room. Bravo had shifted closer to the front window, his lean body low and still as a sniper's shadow. His ears were rigid, angled forward, his gaze never leaving the SUV. Charlie, the youngest, had planted himself by the door, his small frame coiled with the tension of youth. Part fear, part adrenaline, part instinct screaming that something was wrong. Sylvia noticed his tail, usually a lazy wag of curiosity, now stiff as iron. Across the diner, Elliot Crane still sat at the counter, his back impossibly straight, his suit perfectly creased. He hadn't touched his coffee in nearly 15 minutes. His piercing blue eyes flicked from the SUV to the reflection in the window, then back again. His right hand rested on the countertop, tapping a slow, patient rhythm. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 more. Tap, tap, tap. It was the rhythm of a man counting down to something only he understood. Sylvia forced herself to move, like nothing had changed. She refilled a trucker's mug with decaf, wiped a spotless section of counter, and even asked Elliot if he'd like another cup. "No," he said without looking at her. "This is fine." His tone was smooth, polite, but empty. It was the voice of a man who had already decided how the evening would end. Minutes ticked by. The desert wind picked up and rattled the crooked wind chime over the diner's door. A teenage waitress named Jody, barely 19 with freckles scattered across her nose like spilled cinnamon, walked out from the kitchen balancing a tray of onion rings. She froze halfway to a booth when Charlie let out a sharp, singular bark. Not aggressive, not fearful, but a clear warning. Elliot's tapping stopped. Slowly, he reached for his coffee cup again, lifting it with the same controlled ease of someone trained to move precisely. Bravo didn't flinch. Alpha rose from his sitting position and padded silently toward the door, positioning himself next to Charlie. Then, with deliberate slowness, Alpha lifted one paw and began dragging it across the dusty floor. One line, then another, then a third. Sylvia felt her heart stutter. 3 lines. Again. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation. The door chimed again, breaking the tension for a brief second. A tall man in his late 30s walked in, wearing a faded trucker cap and a jacket stained with diesel and long miles. Doug Fenley had been stopping at Saguaro Stop for almost a decade on his Tucson to Yuma haul. He was broad-shouldered and ruddy-skinned, with the kind of easy smile that came from long hours talking to no one but the open road. His wife had left him 5 years ago, a fact that made him more patient with strangers and more protective of anyone who looked vulnerable. "Well, would you look at that?" Doug said, nodding toward the 3 dogs now lined up near the door. "Didn't know you were running a rescue? Shelter, Sylvia." "They came in earlier," Sylvia said carefully. "Strays, or something more." Doug crouched, reaching a calloused hand toward Charlie. The pup backed away immediately, lips curling just enough to flash a line of white teeth. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Doug raised both hands in surrender. "All right, boy. Message received." But the message wasn't just for Doug. Every pair of eyes in the diner felt it, the sense that something invisible was shifting around them. The hum of the SUV's engine outside seemed louder now, closer somehow, as if it was crawling up the walls. Sylvia's heart thudded in her chest. She glanced at her phone under the counter. A new text from Rachel flashed across the screen. 5 minutes out. Stay calm. Do not escalate. The timing couldn't be tighter. Elliot set his empty cup down and stood, smoothing the front of his suit jacket with mechanical precision. His lips curled in the faintest, most humorless smile Sylvia had ever seen. "Coffee was stale," he said. "Keep the change." Then he turned and walked toward the door. Bravo shadowed his movement with the patience of a professional handler. Charlie followed a step behind, his growl now a steady, low vibration in his chest. Alpha did not move from his post by the window. Outside, the horizon had begun to swallow the sun, bleeding deep reds and bruised purples across the sky. Shadows stretched long and thin across the parking lot. The SUV's headlights flickered on, a dim amber glow through the tint. And somewhere inside that darkness, a pair of eyes blinked 3 times, a signal that no one except 3 stray dogs had seen. And they were ready to answer it. By the time the sun sank fully behind the jagged line of the Tucson mountains, the desert had transformed into something else entirely. Not the blinding, merciless furnace of daylight, but a darker, more deceptive beast. Heat still clung to the asphalt, bleeding upward in invisible waves, and the air smelled faintly of sagebrush and oil. A single yellow floodlight buzzed above the Saguaro Stop parking lot, casting a weak pool of light that barely pushed back the creeping dusk. The diner's neon sign sputtered and blinked, painting the ground in uneven patches of red and blue. Inside, patrons had gone quiet. Even the jukebox, which had been stubbornly playing Merle Haggard on repeat, now stood silent, as if refusing to intrude on what was about to happen. Sylvia Ramirez stood near the door, heart pounding hard enough to make her ribs ache. Through the wide window, she watched Elliot Crane, calm, deliberate, unnervingly composed, step out into the night. The tall man's gray suit caught the dim light, and the pale scar that cut through the stubble on his jaw seemed sharper in the darkness. He walked with measured strides toward the waiting SUV, his right hand hovering near the inside of his jacket. She had seen enough men like him before. Men who carried themselves like they had all the time in the world because they believed no one would dare stop them. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he wasn't alone. From the diner's doorway, Alpha emerged first, old but unyielding, his heavy frame moving with the silent precision of a veteran who had fought too many battles to waste energy on theatrics. He placed himself squarely in Elliot's path, shoulders squared, chest low, amber eyes fixed and unblinking. Bravo followed, his smaller, sinewy body hugging the shadows of parked cars as he moved behind the man. His nose twitched rapidly, calculating every step like a tactician anticipating the next 3 moves. And then came Charlie, all youthful intensity and raw instinct, circling wide until he slipped behind Elliot, his body crouched low, muscles coiled like a spring. The 3 formed a perfect triangle, a silent, living perimeter, and for the first time that night, Elliot hesitated. His icy blue eyes darted between them, then back toward the SUV. He exhaled once, almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in the sound. "You should have stayed inside," he muttered, voice colder than the desert wind. Then, in one fluid motion, his hand moved. The flap of his jacket shifted just enough for Sylvia to see the dull gleam of metal as a black Sig Sauer pistol cleared the holster. But Elliot had underestimated Charlie. Before the gun could rise above waist level, the young shepherd launched himself forward like a released arrow. Teeth met flesh with a sickening crack, sinking deep into Elliot's forearm. His body jerked violently as he let out a roar, not of pain but rage, and the gun slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground near Alpha's feet. Elliot stumbled back, swinging his free hand wildly as Charlie clamped tighter, refusing to let go. "Get off!" he shouted, staggering toward the SUV. Bravo sprang into motion, lunging for Elliot's leg and forcing him down onto one knee. The man tried to recover, reaching for the fallen weapon, but Alpha moved first. One massive paw slammed onto the pistol, pinning it to the asphalt. His teeth bared, a low, ancient growl rolled from his chest, the kind of sound that needed no translation. The diner doors burst open as Doug Fenley sprinted out, his broad-shouldered frame cutting through the night air. Behind him, the teenager Jody stumbled after, phone in hand, voice trembling as she shouted to the 911 dispatcher. "He's armed! There's a man! He's armed!" Sylvia followed, her breath catching in her chest. The scene before her felt almost surreal. The towering man in the expensive suit on his knees, his blood dripping dark and steady onto the pavement, surrounded by 3 stray dogs that moved with military precision. Then, from inside the SUV, there was a movement. At first, just a shadow shifting behind the tinted glass. Then a weak thud. And another. Sylvia's heart lurched as she stepped closer and peered through the window. There, in the back seat, was a man slumped against the door, his hands bound with silver duct tape, his mouth sealed, his face swollen and bruised. It was James Carter. James was in his early 40s, though the abuse had aged him a decade. His skin, normally tan from years spent outdoors, was mottled with purple and yellow bruises. A jagged cut traced the line of his cheekbone, and his left eye was nearly swollen shut. His clothes, a navy cotton shirt and khaki trousers, were torn and dirty, stained with sweat and blood. Once, James had been a U.S. Army officer, known among his peers for his calm under pressure and a stubborn streak that refused to bend. But retirement hadn't been kind. A messy divorce and a failed business had left him aimless, wandering the Southwest in search of purpose, until, 10 days ago, he vanished. Now Sylvia understood where he'd been, and what Elliot had planned. The sharp wail of sirens shattered the heavy silence. 2 patrol cars screeched into the parking lot, red and blue lights washing the asphalt in frantic color. The lead cruiser skidded sideways, and out stepped Sheriff Rachel Moreno, tactical jacket zipped high, service pistol drawn. "Hands where I can see them," she shouted, her voice carrying the weight of decades of authority. Behind her was Deputy Nathan Kim, a 31-year-old Korean-American officer with a runner's build and a face that still held traces of boyishness, despite the hardened gaze in his dark eyes. Nathan was known for his methodical nature, a stickler for procedure, shaped by a childhood where nothing came easy. His immigrant parents had owned a small grocery store in Phoenix, and from a young age, he'd learned that discipline and persistence were the only ways to survive. Now, he moved with the controlled precision of a man who'd spent years training for nights like this. "Drop to the ground!" Rachel barked. Elliot, still pinned by Charlie's bite and Bravo's weight, spat a curse but complied, raising his uninjured hand above his head as Nathan rushed forward to cuff him. Blood streaked the man's sleeve, dark and wet against the pale fabric of his suit. "Gun on the ground," Nathan called. Alpha shifted slightly, revealing the pistol beneath his paw. Nathan collected it with a gloved hand and tucked it into an evidence bag. "Check the vehicle," Rachel ordered. Bravo and Charlie stepped back as she approached the SUV, peering inside before motioning to Nathan. With a heavy swing, he smashed the rear window with the butt of his flashlight, shards of tinted glass scattering across the ground. He reached in and unlocked the door, pulling it open with a metallic groan. "Get me paramedics now," Rachel shouted as she and Sylvia gently helped James out of the car. His legs buckled, and for a terrifying moment, Sylvia thought he might collapse completely. But Alpha was there, pressing his body against James's leg, steadying him as he stumbled onto the asphalt. James's eyes fluttered open, dull with exhaustion but alive. He tried to speak, but the tape still clung to his mouth. Rachel tore it away in one swift motion. His first breath came out as a ragged gasp. And then, barely above a whisper, 2 words. "Thank you." The parking lot was a storm of movement now. Officers swarmed the scene. EMTs, led by Sandra Ortega, a compact woman in her mid-40s with cropped silver hair and calm, maternal eyes, knelt beside James, checking his pulse and murmuring reassurances. Bravo paced a few feet away, his sharp gaze tracking every human motion, while Charlie finally released Elliot's arm and retreated to Alpha's side, tail still stiff, but no longer trembling. As the adrenaline faded, Sylvia found herself staring at the 3 dogs, their coats dusty, their ribs faintly visible under thin layers of muscle, their eyes burning with the same fire that had carried them this far. They weren't pets, they weren't strays, they were something else entirely, something bigger, and tonight they had saved a man's life. The parking lot of Saguaro Stop had emptied by midnight, but the scene still pulsed with energy. Police tape fluttered gently in the cooling desert wind, its bright yellow edges glowing under the rhythm of patrol car strobes. The heavy, metallic scent of adrenaline still clung to the air, mixed with engine oil and the faint sweetness of creosote. Where chaos had erupted only hours earlier, order now fought to reassert itself, slowly, methodically, piece by piece. Sheriff Rachel Moreno stood near the hood of a cruiser, arms folded, eyes fixed on the impounded gray SUV, as forensic techs in pale blue gloves worked around it. Her face, sharp and composed, betrayed nothing, but inside her mind, raced. She had handled organized crime before. Drug networks, stolen weapons rings, even cartel scouts slipping across the border. But this felt different. This was quieter, more deliberate, and that made it far more dangerous. Across the lot, Deputy Nathan Kim crouched beside the SUV's open trunk, flashlight beam slicing through the dark interior. "Bravo's onto something," he called over his shoulder. The sable-coated shepherd stood poised beside him, nose buried against the spare tire compartment, tail stiff as a rod. Nathan ran a gloved hand along the seam of the lining and froze when his fingertips brushed against something hard and unfamiliar. He pried at the edge until it gave way with a soft pop, revealing a false panel taped into place. Beneath it, stacked neatly like layers of an ugly secret, were manila folders, laminated IDs, and thick bundles of mixed currency, US dollars, pesos, and a scattering of euros. Rachel joined him, her boots crunching against gravel. She flipped open one of the folders and scanned the pages under the beam of Nathan's light. "Names," she murmured. "Dozens of them." Each page was a dossier. Photos, birth dates, last known addresses, and coded annotations beside each one. Some were marked with dollar signs. Others had red X's. One name, James Carter, was circled in blue ink. Rachel's jaw tightened. "This isn't just trafficking," she said. "This is a marketplace." It wasn't long before Detective Luis Ortega arrived from the county's organized crime unit. Ortega was a man who looked as if he'd been carved from the same weathered sandstone as the Arizona desert. Early 50s, short but broad-shouldered, his olive skin lined deeply from decades of field work and sun. His thick black hair, streaked with gray, was combed back neatly, and a pair of rectangular glasses sat low on his strong nose. He was known for his patience, a meticulous investigator whose habit of rechecking every lead twice had both annoyed and saved his department more times than they could count. "Got here as fast as I could," Ortega said, sliding a cigarette behind his ear, but never lighting it. "Heard you found something big." Rachel handed him a folder. Ortega's eyes scanned the pages quickly, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. "These IDs. I've seen templates like this before. Mexican cartel networks use them to move people under legitimate covers. Look here. Dual language, counterfeit notary stamps. This isn't freelance work." He held up another file. "This one's a missing persons case from Santa Fe. This one's from San Antonio. And this," he paused, "is a 17-year-old girl who disappeared 6 months ago from Albuquerque." The silence between them carried more weight than words. They both knew what it meant. Elliot Crane wasn't just a random kidnapper. He was part of a larger chain, a transport specialist, a mover in a machine that thrived on invisibility. Meanwhile, Bravo continued to circle the SUV, nose pressed low to the ground. He stopped abruptly at the driver's seat and pawed twice at the underside of the dash. Nathan leaned in, popped the glove compartment, and found a small black flash drive taped to the back panel. He handed it to Ortega, who slipped it into an evidence bag. "We'll get our tech guys to run it," Ortega said. "If we're lucky, there's communication data, routes, buyers, maybe even drop points." On the far side of the lot, Alpha sat near James Carter, who had been transported back from the hospital for a brief interview. The former officer was wrapped in a department-issued blanket, an IV line still taped to his wrist. His face, though bruised and drawn, was steadier now. The shock had faded, replaced by the kind of quiet resolve that only soldiers and survivors seem to find. James was in his early 40s, but the hard years showed. Crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, a stubborn line between his brows, and a roughness to his hands that spoke of a life spent building and fixing, even when everything else was breaking. "They moved me 3 times, he told Rachel, his voice hoarse but steady. "Different vehicles, different back roads. Each time they kept the windows covered. But I heard names, Greaves and Newark. Greaves was calling the shots." Rachel nodded slowly. They had Elliot. Now they had a second name. It took another hour before the second suspect was in custody. Martin Greaves, 56, was arrested at a storage facility 20 miles north of Tucson. A lean, hawk-faced man with thinning, sandy hair and narrow, calculating eyes, Greaves had the kind of appearance that allowed him to disappear in plain sight. The unremarkable face of a man who had learned how to make himself forgettable. But his past told a louder story. Once a long-haul trucker, he had been fired after a smuggling conviction 15 years earlier. Since then, he had drifted from state to state, always near the border, always just under the radar. Now, he was in the back of a squad car, wrists bound, sneering silently at the night sky. By dawn, the first headlines had already appeared online. A shaky, cell phone video shot by a young waitress, Jody's trembling voice audible behind the lens, showed Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie surrounding Elliot, their coordinated movements playing out like a choreographed operation. The footage cut to the moment James was pulled from the SUV, battered but alive. Within hours, the clip hit 1 million views. By noon, it was everywhere. Morning shows, national news, even military forums buzzing with speculation. 3 stray dogs foil human trafficking attempt, one headline read. Heroic shepherds save missing veteran, said another. But for Rachel and Ortega, the viral attention was secondary. What mattered were the files, the money, and the drive. Evidence that connected Crane and Greaves to something much larger than either man. As technicians sifted through the data, a clearer picture emerged. Over the past 3 years, more than 24 people, mostly women and veterans with few family ties, had vanished along a corridor stretching from El Paso to San Diego. Many of their names were in those folders. And now they finally had proof that someone was selling them. Late in the afternoon, Rachel returned to the impound lot where the 3 dogs had been temporarily kenneled for veterinary checks. Alpha was lying down, eyes half closed but still alert. Bravo paced the length of the cage with the precision of a guard on duty. Charlie, ever the youngest, wagged his tail nervously whenever someone passed by. Rachel crouched in front of Alpha, meeting his amber gaze. "You're not strays," she said quietly. "You're professionals." Detective Ortega stepped up beside her, holding a stack of printed reports. "You know," he said, "I ran their microchip scans. Nothing. No registry, no owners. It's like they don't exist." Rachel stared at them for a long moment. Maybe they were military K-9s. Maybe they were dumped after service. Or maybe... She allowed herself a rare, small smile. Maybe they chose to keep working. Some mysteries, she thought, didn't need solving. Some deserved to remain stories whispered by those who believed. The Arizona sun was softer now, no longer the brutal blaze that had scorched the desert just weeks earlier. Spring had crept into Tucson quietly, painting the dusty horizon with hints of green and weaving a cool breeze through the mesquite trees that lined the back roads. On the outskirts of town, nestled between a stretch of low sandstone ridges and a field of yellow wildflowers, a new building stood where there had once been only abandoned farmland. Its walls, built from reclaimed wood and pale adobe, still smelled of fresh varnish and sun-baked clay. Above its wide iron gate, a simple wooden sign swayed gently in the wind. It read, "Guardian's Haven, where loyalty never ends." James Carter paused at the gate, the morning light washing over his weathered face. Recovery had changed him. The deep bruises on his jaw had faded, the hollowed look in his eyes replaced by something steadier, a quiet determination that came from surviving something he hadn't thought he would. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw that had once been hidden under a short, military-style beard. Now clean-shaven, his features carried a mixture of strength and weariness. There were faint scars on his wrists from the duct tape that had bound him, but he didn't hide them. They were reminders, not of captivity, but of survival. He pushed the gate open and stepped into the wide courtyard beyond. The compound was alive with sound, barking, paws scuffing against gravel, the rhythmic thud of boots from volunteers walking dogs in training. What had once been an empty stretch of land was now a fully operational rescue and rehabilitation center for working dogs, especially those like Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Sylvia Ramirez was already there, clipboard in hand, her salt and pepper hair pulled into its usual bun. She had traded her diner apron for a pair of well-worn jeans, hiking boots, and a faded green button-up shirt. There was a new ease in her posture, a lightness that had been missing for years. She moved between pens and training fields like someone who had finally found a purpose big enough to carry her grief. "Morning, soldier," she called out with a small smile as James approached. "Morning, ma'am," he replied, a touch of humor in his voice. "You ever think we'd be doing this?" "Not in a million years," she said, "but I think Felix would have liked it." They walked side by side through the facility, passing volunteers cleaning kennels and fitting new collars. Megan Alvarez, one of the new staff members, waved as they passed. Megan was in her early 30s, tall and athletic, with shoulder-length auburn hair tucked into a baseball cap and freckles scattered across her sun-tanned cheeks. A former veterinary technician who had spent years working with rescue animals in New Mexico, she was known for her steady hands and sharper wit, losing her younger brother, a paramedic, in a roadside accident 3 years earlier had driven her to dedicate her life to animal-assisted therapy. Believing that dogs could heal wounds, people could not. "Bravo's nose is already breaking records," she reported with a grin. "We set up a scent trail over half a mile, and he tracked it in less than 5 minutes. James nodded approvingly. Bravo trotted past them just then, his sable coat gleaming in the morning sun, nose pressed low to the ground as he followed an invisible trail with laser focus. Once astray with no direction, he was now the lead scent detection dog of the program. Further ahead, Alpha was leading a training session on the main field. The old shepherd's once grizzled fur was now brushed and shining, but his scarred muzzle and amber eyes still told stories of experience. He walked calmly beside a group of younger rescue dogs, correcting their movements with subtle growls and nudges. Watching him work was like watching an old general instruct new recruits, patient but firm, commanding without ever raising his voice. "Alpha's the best teacher I've ever had," James said, "and I spent 20 years in the Corps." "Dogs don't yell," Sylvia replied with a chuckle. "They just lead." Near the far side of the compound, a small fenced area had been transformed into a therapy zone. Wooden benches were scattered beneath shade canopies, and colorful toys were strewn across the grass. Charlie, the youngest of the trio, was there, sitting quietly beside a boy no older than 9. The child's name was Ethan Porter, a pale, freckle-faced kid with sandy brown hair and wary green eyes. He had been referred to Guardian's Haven by a local counselor after losing his father, a firefighter, in a warehouse collapse the previous winter. Since then, Ethan had barely spoken a word. But with Charlie, something was different. The pup leaned gently against the boy's leg, his tail thumping lazily against the grass. Ethan reached out a trembling hand, hesitating before resting it on Charlie's head. The dog didn't move. Instead, he let out a soft, reassuring huff, a sound that made the corners of the boy's mouth twitch into the faintest smile. "That's the third kid he's helped this month," Megan said softly as she joined them. "They talk to him before they talk to anyone else. It's like he knows exactly what to do." James watched silently, his chest tightening. He had seen combat, chaos, and cruelty, but nothing hit him quite like watching a dog rebuild a child's trust in the world. By late afternoon, the center was buzzing with activity. A group of local high school students arrived to volunteer, carrying bags of donated food and toys. Among them was Leanne Porter, Ethan's mother, a woman in her mid-30s with chestnut hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, and the weathered hands of someone used to hard work. She was a single parent, juggling 2 jobs to keep her small family afloat. The tragedy of losing her husband had carved fine worry lines around her eyes, but here, those lines softened. She knelt beside Charlie and Ethan, tears gathering quietly as she watched her son laugh, really laugh, for the first time in months. "Thank you," she whispered to Sylvia. "I don't know what we'd do without this place." Sylvia placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone. None of us are." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the compound, James stood at the edge of the training field and looked out over everything they had built. It was more than a rescue center now. It was a refuge, for the dogs, for the people they helped, and for those who needed a reason to believe again. The sign over the gate creaked softly in the wind. "Where loyalty never ends." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise, and every bark, every paw print, every healed heart that passed through Guardian's Haven was proof that loyalty, once given, never truly died. Spring settled over Tucson with a gentleness that felt almost foreign. The desert, once a landscape of relentless heat and sharp horizons, now bloomed with pale wildflowers and soft winds that carried the scent of mesquite and rain-soaked earth. At Guardian's Haven, the mornings were marked by the rhythmic thump of paws on gravel, the laughter of children, and the low, comforting hum of life rebuilding itself. For Sylvia Ramirez, it was the sound of healing, not just for the dogs they rescued, but for everyone who walked through the gates with something broken inside. It was on one of those bright mornings that Micah Ellison arrived. The boy was 8, small and thin for his age, with unruly chestnut hair that curled slightly over his ears, and eyes the deep color of river stones. He wore a faded flannel shirt 2 sizes too big and scuffed sneakers that had clearly belonged to someone else before him. Micah's mother, Leanne Ellison, had called ahead. She was in her early 30s, her dark hair tied back into a simple braid, her hands calloused from long hours working as a park ranger in nearby Coronado National Forest. Since losing her husband, a fellow ranger killed in a landslide while leading a rescue mission, Micah had stopped speaking altogether. Counselors had tried, teachers had tried. Nothing worked. But as he stepped through the gate of Guardian's Haven, something in him shifted. Charlie was the first to notice. The youngest of the trio, barely 2 years old now but already known for his uncanny empathy, trotted over without hesitation. He was lean and strong, his tan and black coat catching the morning light, his amber eyes wide with curiosity and patience. He stopped a few feet from Micah, tail wagging gently, and simply sat down. No barking, no sudden movement, just quiet presence. Micah stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he crouched down and extended a trembling hand. Charlie pressed his nose into the boy's palm with the softest nudge. It was enough. Something cracked open. The boy smiled, the first real smile his mother had seen in nearly 7 months. Sylvia watched the moment unfold from the porch, her heart swelling. "That's how it always starts," she whispered to James, who had stepped up beside her. James, his broad frame relaxed for the first time in weeks, folded his arms and nodded. "Dogs don't need words," he said quietly. "They just listen." Micah and Charlie were inseparable from that day forward. The boy came to the center 3 times a week, at first clinging to his mother's side, but eventually venturing out on his own. He followed Charlie around the training field, tossed tennis balls across the courtyard, and sometimes just sat under the mesquite tree, with his hand resting on the shepherd's back. Slowly, words returned. They were small at first, whispered commands, short sentences, but every syllable was a victory. The story of Micah and Charlie spread through the town like a gentle tide, drawing more families to Guardian's Haven, veterans struggling with PTSD, children coping with trauma, even first responders who had seen too much. They all came, drawn by stories of 3 stray dogs who refused to give up. Meanwhile, justice was unfolding far beyond the fences of the Haven. In a federal courtroom in Phoenix, Elliot Crane and Martin Greaves faced trial for kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy. The proceedings were long and grueling, filled with evidence unearthed from the flash drives and files Bravo had helped discover. Witnesses testified, including survivors from other states whose names had appeared in those folders. Among them was Clara McMillan, a 27-year-old woman with copper-colored hair and a fragile voice, who described how she had been smuggled across 3 state lines before finally escaping. Her testimony, trembling but resolute, painted a picture of an organized network that had thrived on silence and fear. Elliot sat through the trial, stone-faced, his once cold confidence eroded under the weight of evidence. Martin, gaunt and hollow-eyed, avoided looking at the gallery altogether. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in quiet sobs and relieved gasps. The sentence was swift: life imprisonment without parole. News of the conviction swept across the country, but the headlines that captured the nation's attention weren't about Elliot or Martin. They were about the dogs. The silent guardians, 3 shepherds that saved lives. Read one article, another called them heroes without badges. Across social media, photos of Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie standing proudly outside Guardian's Haven went viral, and visitors began leaving notes, flowers, and hand-drawn pictures at the gate. Inside the center's main hall, Sylvia and James decided to commemorate the journey. They commissioned a large mural on the front wall, a dramatic painting of 3 German shepherds standing before a shadowed SUV under a moonlit desert sky. Beneath it, in bold, carved letters, were the words, "The Silent Guardians." The mural became a symbol not just for what had happened, but for what the future could hold, a reminder that even in a world filled with noise, the quietest acts of courage could change lives. Months passed. Guardian's Haven grew. They added new training programs, therapy initiatives, and a small clinic to treat injured strays. Volunteers arrived from out of state, some former handlers who believed Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie might have once been military K-9s abandoned after service. But whether they had been soldiers or simply strays who refused to walk away, one thing was certain: they had found their mission again. One evening, as the Arizona sky deepened into indigo and the stars blinked awake, Sylvia sat on the wooden steps of the porch, a cup of mint tea cradled in her hands. Alpha lay stretched beside her, his grizzled muzzle resting on his paws, eyes half closed in the cool night air. Bravo stood watch near the fence line, his silhouette sharp and statuesque against the moonlight. Charlie, exhausted from an afternoon of play with Micah, snored softly by the boy's side under the old mesquite tree. James joined her, leaning against the porch railing with a quiet sigh. "Do you ever think about how close we were to never finding any of this?" he asked. "All the time," Sylvia said. But maybe that's how miracles work. They don't shout. They just happen. They sat in silence, the desert night wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing over the open plain. Inside the center, the mural glowed faintly under the porch lights. 3 dogs, a dark SUV, and the words that now defined everything they believed in. Sylvia took a deep breath and looked out across the courtyard. "Not all heroes wear badges," she whispered. "Some have 4 legs and a heart that listens. Sometimes God's miracles don't come with thunder, angels, or shining lights. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on 4 paws, with loyal hearts and eyes that see what others miss." Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie remind us that even in the darkest hours, hope still walks beside us. It may not roar, it may not shout, but it shows up in the kindness of strangers, in the strength to keep going, and in the love that refuses to give up. In our everyday lives, we often rush past small blessings, forgetting that the greatest miracles are often hidden in ordinary moments: a helping hand, a loyal friend, a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, those moments are God's way of telling us that we are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your story matters too. And don't forget to subscribe, because more incredible stories of faith, love, and second chances are coming. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He guide you through the storms and send light, even if it comes on 4 legs, when you need it most.